Dear ISAT viewers, today we have a special guest in our studio, Kathleen O'Connor. She is the Deputy Chief of the Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section for the United States Department of Justice's Criminal Division. Kathleen, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for allowing me to reach out to your viewers and your listeners.
Yeah, we are so much happy that you are here. Would you please tell our audience about yourself?
Certainly. Kathleen O'Connor. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division's Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section in the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm a career prosecutor, formerly worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and then I've been working at the Criminal Division now for about 8 years. And the Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section is a section that is relatively new and has 3 separate portfolios.
Tell us a little bit about the organization and what you have been doing since 2010.
Okay, so in 2010, Congress created the Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section. It is a merger of 2 sections within the Criminal Division. The old section was of the Office of Special Investigations. Many people may know that as the Nazi hunters. They essentially went after World War II violators, and the second section is called the Domestic Security Section, and they primarily worked on international violent crime. So those 2 sections merged in 2010 to create the Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section. That section has 3 portfolios. The one I'm in charge of is the Human Rights portfolio. Then there's the International Violent Crime section, or the portfolio, and then the third portfolio is International Human Smuggling.
Okay. What kind of success stories have you achieved so far?
The Human Rights portfolio, we have 4 main statutes that we work with. That is genocide, torture, the use and recruitment of child soldiers, and war crimes. So essentially, our mission within the section is to look for human rights violators who are here in the United States. These are people who have come to the United States. They may have gained status, but they have committed bad acts, human rights violations, atrocities back in their home countries. We want to ensure that the United States is no safe haven to human rights violators.
How many people have you convicted so far since 2010?
Well, so our section works closely with U.S. attorneys' offices. There are 94 offices throughout the United States, and we work closely with them, and together we work with them to look for human rights violators and then investigate and prosecute. So in the past several years that we've been in existence, we've had a number of cases, including cases that came out of Rwanda, Guatemala, and also some that have come out of the Balkans. So about, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 convictions at this point, and one recently that also came out of Ethiopia.
Okay, tell us more about that. Yes, we heard about the conviction of Kathleen O'Connor, who was a former human rights violator from Ethiopia. What kind of process it took you to convict him?
So that case was investigated by HSI ICE together with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, Colorado. And Worku came to the United States from Ethiopia, where in the 1970s he was an official in a prison that detained political prisoners during the Red Terror. And that prison was called Higher 15. You may have heard of that.
Yes.
So Worku worked in that prison as an official, and he was responsible for torture, maiming, and execution of political prisoners. After that, he went to Kenya and was in a refugee camp. And through smuggling units, he was able to assume the identification of another person and managed to come to the United States as a refugee and he moved to Denver, Colorado, where there is a large Ethiopian population. He lived in Denver for many years and sought legal permanent residency. He sought asylum, he received asylum, and he eventually became a U.S. citizen. Sometime later, while he was living in the community, he was recognized by a person who had been detained in that Higher 15 prison. That person saw him, recognized him, and said, "I know you." And fortunately, that person, who was originally from Ethiopia but had eventually become a U.S. citizen, he went to law enforcement, he went to ICE, HSI, and he told them about this person and told them who he was. And so together with ICE, the U.S. Attorney's Office began a very lengthy and intensive investigation and confirmed that in fact he had come to the United States under a false identification, and he had in fact worked at that prison, and he in fact had tortured and executed people. So after this investigation, he went on trial back in October of 2013 in a federal courthouse in front of a jury, and after all of the evidence came in, including witnesses and documents confirming and corroborating the testimony of the witnesses, he was convicted by the jury, and in May of this year, he was sentenced by a federal judge to 22 years. And importantly, he was also stripped of his U.S. citizenship.
So where is he now? He's waiting for going to prison, or?
He's serving his sentence in prison, in a federal prison, and he has 22 years to serve. And considering the fact that he was 65 at the time that he was convicted, you know.
Yeah, he may survive, he may not survive. If he survives, that means he will be deported to Ethiopia and may face another charge there.
That may be the case. It's not quite clear. In fact, Ethiopia had convicted him in absentia while he was here. So the immigration proceedings will occur after he serves his sentence, but that's in a very long time.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. What kind of message this conviction sends, especially to the people who are committing human rights violation right now, whether it is at the global level or in Ethiopia?
Well, we hope that it sends a message to human rights violators, persons who are responsible for committing atrocities against civilian populations, people who are responsible for torture or recruiting and using child soldiers for war crimes, for genocide, that impunity for those offenses has ended. And we work closely, not only here domestically in the United States, with our law enforcement partners, that is ICE, HSI, and the FBI, but we also work globally with the international law enforcement community to send a message to those persons that it is not acceptable, you will be held accountable, and you cannot come to the United States. This is no safe haven.
That's a great message. Was it very hard for you to find and convince people to testify against their former tormentors?
Well, that's a very good question. And yes, it is difficult because these cases are complex. These cases are lengthy. Oftentimes, as in the case of Mr. Worku, his conduct occurred in the 1970s, which is over 30 years ago, on a continent far away, in a country many miles away. So to gather evidence, to corroborate testimony, takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money. It's resource intensive. But fortunately, we have very passionate investigators and prosecutors, and in fact, we actually, in our section, have historians who work together as a team to go after these individuals, to build a case, and to present these cases to the jury. But I will say, the one great thing about this case was that those individuals who lived in Denver and saw him and recognized him didn't hold that information into themselves. You could imagine seeing that person and saying, yes, emotion, but also wondering, well, how in the world could the United States hold him accountable? It happened far away many years ago, but the message is oftentimes we can. Sometimes we may not be able to, but we're certainly going to make every effort to do that. And there are many remedies, including the substantive statutes, immigration fraud statutes, and all kinds of financial crime statutes that we can use, as well as administrative proceedings where we can remove the person from the United States. And very importantly, we can keep people from coming here. So your listeners should understand that reporting those human rights violators, even ones that haven't yet reached the shores of the United States, is very important to do.
Yes, because they should not focus only on those who are already in the United States, but people who are also committing and far away from the United States, so that your embassies could be able to prevent them from coming here.
Yes, and I understand some of your listeners may live in Africa or other places. Not necessarily everyone lives here, so
yes,
it is an important message.
Because this is a satellite program where people can watch it in Ethiopia, in Africa, so this is an important message where they should know that they should also report people who are violating human rights while they are away from the United States, so that you could be able to prevent them from coming.
Exactly.
What kind of conducts and conditions are you looking for to convict someone who has violated human rights?
It starts with a tip. And so to assist people in making those reports, we have created a tip line and an email tip line, which people can use. They don't have to identify themselves. It can be an anonymous tip. So we have established these tip lines for reporting. So it starts with the tip, but we don't act on a tip. In other words, we're not going to go arrest someone on a tip. We're not going to put someone in jail on a tip. We are not going to announce to the world we're investigating this person on a tip, because we understand that sometimes tips come in and they're politically motivated, perhaps, or there may be differing factions which are trying to put a spotlight on political enemies, let's say. So we're aware of that, and we don't act on that. What we do is we take every tip seriously, and we investigate every tip, and we work to build a case slowly by interviewing witnesses, looking for forensic evidence that corroborates witness testimony, looking for documentary evidence that corroborates witness testimony, and slowly really building a case. And remember, in order for us to prove that someone is guilty of an atrocity, we must show to a jury of 12 individuals that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a very high standard. But again, we're very passionate, we're dedicated to our mission, and we work hard to meet that standard, but we're also cognizant of looking for evidence that truly corroborates the allegations against the person.
So for our audience to understand this thing, before they pick up the phone and call,
right,
what kind of crimes are we talking about?
So the four main statutes that I discussed: genocide, war crimes, torture, and recruitment and use of child soldiers. But I would also include murder, rape, any attacks on a civilian population, especially under color of law, meaning a person that was working for the government, in the military, in the security service, in the government generally, during the time the conduct was committed.
You mentioned about genital mutilation. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Sure. There has been a recent international effort to address female genital mutilation, which is commonly called FGM. In fact, this month in Britain, the UK is holding a summit to address FGM. The United States has a strategy as part of the international effort to address FGM, that is, to prevent and respond to it. It is a procedure that is conducted on women and girls, and there is no medical reason for conducting the procedure. As a result, the CDC did a study within the United States, and in 1997 estimated that almost 200,000 women and girls in the United States are either have been subject to FGM or at risk of being subjected to FGM.
So we're talking about immigrants?
Yes, these are immigrants from primarily African countries and also Middle East countries. And they come here to the United States, and we welcome them here in the United States, but sometimes they bring their cultural practices with them. And it's important for your listeners to understand that there is no medical reason for FGM. It presents huge health risks to the girls and women who undergo it, including sterility, infections, problems with labor and child delivery. And as a result, our Congress in the United States has prohibited the practice. So it is a federal crime to conduct FGM here in the United States. And just last year, Congress amended the statute to include criminal conduct for taking or arranging for a child under the age of 18 to leave the United States to go to another country for the purpose of FGM. So our main goal is to prevent it and to make sure people understand it's a crime and it should not be done. But it is true that, you know, if we come across an individual that has committed it, we can prosecute for that crime.
It's very important for our culture because genital mutilation, especially in the rural parts of Ethiopia, it's common. And if people are still practicing it while they are in the United States, it's a very important message that this is a crime to do that here.
And particularly, it often is conducted on very young girls, the age of 5 years old or 10 years old. And so we want to make sure that people start a dialogue about this and a discussion about this and realize it is not a good practice, and in fact it is criminal behavior.
I know that justice must be served, and past criminals should be subjected to justice. But are you only interested with people who committed crimes, human rights violations from the past, or are you also targeting people who are currently committing this kind of atrocities against humanity, whether it's in the rest of the world or whether it is, for example, in Ethiopia or in Africa?
Yes, both. Certainly people who have come to the United States and who have gained status, immigrant status here in the United States and are on their way to citizenship, we are very interested in that, and often that conduct happened, as I said, 10, 15 years ago. But we're also very interested in those individuals who are currently committing atrocities.
Okay, I was informed that, for example, one high-level official who committed lots of crimes is living in the United States. Now he is living in the United States and enjoying the American dream. So what should be the next step to bring this person to justice? So
that information we're very interested in. So it's helpful for us to know the name of the person, the date of birth of the person, and the place of birth of the person, and the allegation against the person. What do you believe that person did? Any evidence that you have to corroborate that? For example, if you know of witnesses who actually saw that person commit atrocities, or was perhaps he worked in a military unit, maybe you know of a person who worked with him in that military unit. any kind of evidence like that that you can share with us, we encourage you to do so.
Yeah, because I was informed, lots of names. I just mentioned one because as I prepared for this interview, people told me, hey, there are lots of higher level officials who used to commit atrocity and human rights violations in Ethiopia, but they are living here as citizens and also as permanent residents. So there are lots of people who are living in the United States committed those kinds of atrocities.
We are very aware that that is the case, and so that is one of the reasons that I was so happy that you invited me to come on your show today, so we can get that message out. Yes, please report those individuals. And so we have two, as I said, two tip lines. One is an email address, and that is hrsp@usdoj.gov. And then we also have a phone tip line, which is an 800 number, and that number is 800-813-5863. And again, your listeners can report that information anonymously. They do not have to use their name. But clearly, the more information that we have, the more evidence that we have, the stronger our case is going to be, and the more able we are to bring an investigation and ultimately a prosecution against these individuals.
Another question I have is about people who collaborated. They might not be involving in terms of doing that physical act of torture, for example, but they might have been part of the, the torturing, not only physically, also mentally, because I read from your website that torturing is not only physical, it could be mental. There are, politicians, judges, and prosecutors who ordered and also prosecuted, innocent people, and they caused mental torture on their victims and also on their families. And they may be here in the United States. And even I have one case where he used to be one of the prosecutors who jailed known journalists like Iskender Nega and opposition leader Dale Maraki and many politicians and activists. So this person is in the United States. So are you also targeting this kind of individuals who ordered torture, and also those judges and prosecutors who falsified information to imprison people unjustly?
Yes, so the answer to all those questions is yes, we are very interested in this. Now, each case we have to look at individually, and we have to look at the facts. What facts do we have to support that allegation? And again, we will do that investigation. We again work with our law enforcement partners, but we will engage in that investigation, and if we can develop facts that support a charge, we will bring it. It's important to understand, however, that we need jurisdiction over the person, the conduct, and we do not have in the United States this concept of superior liability. So just because a person was in charge of a unit, in charge of the military, in charge of a government organization, they are not necessarily liable under our law unless we can show that they participated in it, that they ordered it, that they witnessed and didn't do anything about it, that they watched torture occur and they didn't do anything about it. So just being the head of a unit is not going to cut it for us under U.S. law, but we will work to gather that evidence. And so I encourage your listeners to report that information, and we will look for it.
What about people who are also in power right now, but who have committed atrocities, human rights violations, and they come to the United States for a visit, let's say, or for official purpose? Are you also interested to target this kind of officials and authorities?
We're definitely interested in the allegations against them, and we're definitely interested in knowing the fact that they're coming over. These kinds of cases, because a person who is currently in power in their official capacity often are very complicated legally, whether we can address that conduct, whether we can do anything about that person when he comes to the United States. Very complicated legal issues, very fact specific, and the U.S. government as an interagency works together to address those issues. So we do look at that, we do take it very seriously, and we work with our interagency partners regarding officials who come here for official business who have committed atrocities. But I will tell you that if those individuals come to the United States and seek immigration benefits and seek status here in the United States, seek to become a resident of the United States or a citizen, we definitely will go after those individuals.
Okay. You mentioned about you working with other interagency organizations in the United States
Right.
and abroad.
Right.
What about working with multinational human rights organizations, for example, like Human Rights Watch? Do you use their data because they might have lots of information about human rights violations of each country? Even the State Department of the United States,
Right.
they have annual reports about human rights violation. Do you use those data and work with these organizations too?
Absolutely. And the benefit of working in my section in the criminal division at the U.S. Department of Justice is that we do have a cadre of historians who regularly look at those reports from the State Department human rights reports, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all the various NGOs who are really on the ground doing terrific work and really investigating. We look at those reports, we use those as we build cases. And not only our historians and our paralegals help to inform our cases through these very important reports, but also ICE and FBI have analysts who use those reports as well to inform the investigations.
What kind of incentive do you give to people who testify against former human rights abusers?
Incentive, I think the incentive is to do the right thing, to tell the truth, to prevent this person from living the American dream here in the United States. That's the incentive. Now, having said that, we are very concerned and cognizant of the issues that surround witnesses and victims testifying in our cases. Sometimes our victims and witnesses may be located in countries all over the world.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're here in the United States. So in the Worku case, the Denver Ethiopian man who was convicted, many of the witnesses and victims were here in the United States. But some of the cases that we're looking at right now, our witnesses are overseas. So we always take into consideration the safety and the concerns of victims and witnesses before we prosecute the case, before we bring those victims and witnesses in to testify. And I mentioned that we have 94 U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the United States. Each of those offices has a victim witness office and victim witness coordinators who work closely with witnesses and victims to make sure they understand the proceedings, their safety concerns are met, their health concerns are met, their psychological concerns are met, and we make sure that the victim and witness concerns are primary to us going forward in a case.
How do you protect people who testify against retributions?
Well, we also have witness protection program here in the United States, both formal programs and informal programs. And so again, each person, we look at the exact circumstances of that individual, and we work closely with that person to address their security concerns and to make sure that those concerns are met before we proceed.
I went to your website and I saw that you have a brochure with multiple language, French, Spanish, even Amharic.
Yes.
And also I saw that your tip line, someone can call and leave message in Amharic.
Yes.
So they can use their local language to leave message to you.
Yes.
They don't need to be fluent in English to leave message.
That's a good point. Yes, that's true. We work with linguists and we can translate those calls and understand the information. So there's nothing really that should stop your listeners and your viewers from making those reports, and we encourage that.
Is there any other investigations other than Ethiopians you are working right now actively?
So yes, we have an investigation that involves individuals who are leaving Eritrea, trying to escape that country, and during the process of leaving Eritrea and moving to another country, they're often kidnapped and taken to the Sinai. When it is discovered that those individuals may have relatives in the West, especially in the United States, those individuals are tortured while their relatives in the United States are listening on the cell phone, and the relatives here in the United States are then extorted for money in order to release their relative from torture and from captivity. We know those individuals are here in the United States, and we urge, for example, those individuals to come forward and report and tell us about what has happened to them, because that, in fact, is a crime that we can pursue. We've also had a recent conviction out of Guatemala. So there was a man who came to the United States and sought asylum. He had been a Special Forces soldier in Guatemala during the Civil War, and he had gone into a small town called Dos Aires, where he and his military unit completely eradicated the town. They killed men, women, and children. They threw children down the village well while they were still alive, and when that well was exhumed, the bodies of those children were exhumed, and there were 250 villagers killed, and over 65% of those individuals were children under the age of 12. This man came to the United States, who led that unit, that military unit. He came to the United States and he sought asylum. He was denied asylum in the United States, so he moved to Canada and sought asylum. He received asylum in Canada, and then he married a U.S. citizen, returned to the United States, and became a U.S. citizen. He was living in California. He had opened a number of martial arts studios, and again, he was living the American dream. And some prosecutor in Guatemala told us about him, that he was living here. We investigated him. We slowly built a case. We got the forensic evidence of the exhumed bodies from the village well. We received documentary evidence of his military status in Guatemala, and slowly built a case against him. We prosecuted him, and in October of last year, he was convicted of immigration fraud. Here again is a case where we could not charge him with the substantive crime of war crimes or torture or extrajudicial killings, because the conduct occurred before our statutes were enacted. But we could charge him with immigration fraud, and he was convicted by the jury, sentenced by the judge to the maximum sentence, which is 10 years, stripped of his citizenship, and when he is finished with his sentence, again, he's an elderly man, so when he's finished with his sentence, we will see, the immigration process after that. So we are looking for human rights violators from all over the world, wherever they may have committed their atrocities, whether it's Central America, Mexico, Latin America, South America, Asia, the Middle East, anywhere where that conduct has occurred.
By the way, the case you mentioned about Guatemala, it reminded me the genocides that have been conducted in Ethiopia, in Gambela region, and Somalia region. Lots of people were killed, and some of them were killed in mass. So we have the same case in Somalia and in Gambela and other parts of Ethiopia right now as we speak.
And we are looking at all parts of the world, both former atrocities and also present atrocities. We are working closely with our law enforcement partners, with the whole interagency, and in fact the international community, to look at that and to determine whether there's evidence available to us and whether we have jurisdiction over the conduct. or the person, and if we don't, we work with other authorities to make sure that those human rights violators are held accountable. So one example is a man who was living here in the United States, and he was wanted for war crimes in Bosnia, for war crimes that he committed during the Balkans War. Bosnia had both the political will and the capacity to prosecute this man. And because the conduct occurred in Bosnia, we worked closely with the Bosnian prosecutor's office and the Bosnian police to send him back to Bosnia so he could stand trial in the country where he committed that offense. In our mind, that made more sense for them to prosecute him, so we worked closely with them, and they extradited him back to Bosnia to stand trial, and he's currently standing trial in Bosnia.
These are great information. Is there anything you would like to extend to our audience? Anything that you left out?
No, I don't think so. You asked some really terrific questions, and we're so grateful that you invited us onto your program, and we really want your listeners to know that don't think it's too late. Don't think, well, because it happened so long ago, there's no justice. There very well may be justice here in the United States, and if we can hold that person accountable, it really does send a message to the world that human rights violators are, the impunity for their actions will end, has ended.
On behalf of ISAT and our audience, I really appreciate for you to come and give us these great insights and information. Thank you very much for coming once more.
Thanks for inviting us.
Dear our viewers, we hope that you enjoyed this discussion, and also you got all the information you need to make human rights abusers and violators accountable. Use the telephone lines and also emails, contact them and let them know that there are really human rights abusers living the American dream. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good time.